Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, Sarah could be found in her grandfather's garage, learning to fix engines and understanding the mechanics of things that most people took for granted. Her hands were always dirty with grease, her fingernails chipped from working with tools, and her dark hair was perpetually pulled back in a messy ponytail. The tattoo had been her 18th birthday gift to herself. Against her parents' wishes and the horrified gasps of her conservative community, Sarah had walked into the only tattoo parlor in a 3-hour radius and asked for something that would tell her story. The artist, a weathered man named Rico with arms covered in colorful ink, had listened carefully to what she wanted and spent hours carefully etching the design into her left shoulder blade. It wasn't a typical teenage tattoo. There were no butterflies, no infinity symbols, no quotes about living life to the fullest. Instead, Sarah had chosen something that spoke to her soul and her dreams. The tattoo depicted a pair of military dog tags intertwined with angel wings, surrounded by a wreath of forget-me-nots. Beneath the wings, in elegant script, were the words honor, courage, sacrifice, along with a set of coordinates that meant something deeply personal to her. The reaction from her community was immediate and harsh. Sarah's mother, a devout woman who led the church choir, was mortified. Her father, a bank manager who prided himself on respectability, refused to speak to her for weeks. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. At the grocery store, elderly women would shake their heads and mutter about that Martinez girl who ruined herself with that awful tattoo. At school, teachers looked at her with disappointment, as if the ink on her skin had somehow diminished her intelligence or character. "You've thrown away your future," her guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, had said during what was supposed to be a college planning meeting. "No respectable employer will hire someone who looks like that. You need to think about laser removal before it's too late." Sarah had sat quietly through the lecture, her jaw set in determination. She knew that Mrs. Peterson, like everyone else in town, saw only the surface. They saw a rebellious teenager who had made a stupid decision. They didn't understand that every line of her tattoo had been carefully chosen, that it represented something sacred to her, something that connected her to a legacy that ran deeper than their shallow judgments. The tattoo was inspired by her grandfather, Miguel Martinez, who had served 3 tours in Vietnam and had come home to a country that spat on him and called him a baby killer. He had never spoken much about the war, but Sarah had found his military records in the attic one summer day when she was helping her grandmother clean. The coordinates on her tattoo were the exact location where his unit had been ambushed, where he had carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy enemy fire, earning a Bronze Star that he kept hidden in a shoebox along with letters from the families of the men he had saved. Miguel had died when Sarah was 15, and she had been the only one with him in his final moments. As the cancer ravaged his body, he had grabbed her hand with surprising strength and whispered the words that would change her life forever. "Mija, honor is not something you wear on your sleeve for others to see. It's something you carry in your heart, something that guides your actions when no one is watching. Promise me you'll find a way to serve, to make a difference. The world needs good people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." Sarah had made that promise, and the tattoo was her way of keeping Miguel's memory alive, of carrying his values forward into her own life. But explaining this to people in her small town felt impossible. They had already made up their minds about who she was based on the ink on her skin. The harassment intensified during her senior year of high school. Sarah had always been an excellent student, graduating in the top 5% of her class with plans to attend college on an academic scholarship. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities and had her heart set on studying international relations with the goal of eventually working in foreign service. But the tattoo became a constant source of controversy. During senior picture day, the photographer had insisted she wear a high-neck sweater to cover the tattoo, claiming it would be inappropriate for the yearbook. At graduation practice, the principal had pulled her aside and suggested she wear a cardigan over her dress, worried that the tattoo might be visible to the audience. Even at her part-time job at the local bookstore, customers would sometimes make comments about her appearance, with one elderly man going so far as to tell her manager that he didn't feel comfortable being served by someone who obviously makes poor decisions. Sarah's closest friend, Emma, tried to be supportive, but even she sometimes questioned Sarah's choice. I just don't understand why you had to make it so big, Emma would say. If you really wanted a tattoo, couldn't you have gotten something small that you could hide easier? But Sarah knew that hiding wasn't the point. The tattoo wasn't meant to be hidden away like a shameful secret. It was meant to be a visible reminder of the values she had promised her grandfather she would uphold. Every time someone stared at it with judgment, every time someone made a snide comment, Sarah thought of Miguel's words about honor being something you carry in your heart. She drew strength from knowing that she was honoring his memory, even if no one else understood. The summer after graduation, Sarah worked 2 jobs to save money for college expenses. During the day, she worked at a mechanic's shop, using the skills her grandfather had taught her to help with oil changes and basic repairs. In the evenings, she worked at a restaurant, waiting tables and dealing with the occasional rude customer who felt entitled to comment on her appearance. The tattoo was visible when she wore tank tops in the summer heat, and she had learned to develop a thick skin against the judgmental looks and whispered comments. One particularly hot July evening, Sarah was working the dinner shift at Romano's, the nicest restaurant in town. The dining room was full of families celebrating anniversaries and birthdays, and Sarah was focused on providing excellent service despite the oppressive heat and the judgmental atmosphere she had grown accustomed to. She had learned to carry herself with dignity, to smile professionally even when customers made inappropriate comments about her tattoo. A large group had been seated in her section, celebrating what appeared to be a family reunion. Sarah approached the table with menus and water glasses, offering her usual friendly greeting. Most of the family members seemed pleasant enough, chatting among themselves about relatives they hadn't seen in years and catching up on family news. But, as Sarah was taking drink orders, she noticed one of the older women at the table staring at her tattoo with obvious disapproval. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice sharp and condescending. "Could we possibly get a different server? Someone more appropriate?" The entire table fell silent, and Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it never got easier. She maintained her professional composure, keeping her voice steady as she responded. "I'd be happy to find another server for you if you'd prefer," Sarah said politely, even though the woman's words stung. She had worked hard to provide excellent service, and being judged solely on her appearance felt deeply unfair. The woman's adult son looked embarrassed by his mother's behavior. "Mom, that's not necessary," he said quietly. "I'm sure she's a perfectly good waitress." But the woman wasn't finished. "I just think it's inappropriate for someone with such obvious poor judgment to be handling our food," she continued, her voice loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. "That tattoo is absolutely disgusting. What kind of parents let their child mutilate themselves like that?" Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of her grandfather, of his quiet dignity in the face of the horrible treatment he had received after returning from Vietnam. She straightened her shoulders and prepared to walk away with grace, knowing that arguing with the woman would only make the situation worse. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension at the table. An elderly man sitting at the far end, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly stood up. Sarah noticed that despite his casual civilian clothes, he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his posture ramrod straight, and, when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the rude woman with calm but unmistakable firmness, "I think you owe this young lady an apology." The woman looked startled by the intervention. "I beg your pardon? I have every right to request appropriate service." The elderly man stepped closer, and Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. On his wrist was a bracelet that she recognized immediately. It was identical to one her grandfather had worn, a POW MIA bracelet bearing the name of a fallen comrade. The man's eyes were fixed on Sarah's tattoo, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before when people looked at her ink. Instead of judgment or disgust, there was recognition, respect, and something that looked almost like reverence. The tension in the restaurant was palpable as other diners began to notice the confrontation. Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what was happening but sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The elderly man continued to study her tattoo, and she could see his mind working, processing details that others had overlooked or dismissed as meaningless decoration. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now but still carrying unmistakable authority. "Young lady," he said to Sarah, "would you mind telling me about those coordinates on your shoulder?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In all the months of enduring stares and comments about her tattoo, no one had ever bothered to look closely enough to notice the small numbers embedded in the design. No one had cared enough to ask what they meant or why they were important to her. This was the first time anyone had seen beyond the surface, the first time someone had recognized that there might be a deeper story behind the ink. The rude woman looked confused by the question, clearly not understanding why the man was focusing on such details. The rest of the table was equally puzzled, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized that this moment might be different from all the others, that this man might actually understand what her tattoo truly represented. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "those coordinates mark the location where my grandfather's unit was ambushed during the Vietnam War. He saved 3 soldiers that day and earned a Bronze Star for valor." The elderly man's expression changed immediately. The recognition in his eyes deepened, and Sarah saw something else there now, understanding, and perhaps even a hint of emotion that he was trying to control. He nodded slowly, processing this information, and Sarah had the strange feeling that he knew exactly what those coordinates meant, as if he recognized them from his own experience or knowledge of military history. The restaurant had grown quieter around them, with other patrons sensing that something important was happening but not understanding what it was. The rude woman looked increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that her attempt to humiliate Sarah had somehow backfired, though she clearly didn't understand how or why. The elderly man's eyes remained fixed on Sarah's tattoo as silence stretched across the restaurant. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but something in his expression told her that this moment was about to change everything. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a gravity that made everyone in the dining room lean in to listen. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked, and Sarah noticed that his hands, which had been steady moments before, were now trembling slightly. "Miguel Martinez," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke her grandfather's name. "Sergeant Miguel Martinez, 1st Infantry Division." The man's breath caught audibly. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if processing painful memories, and, when he opened them again, Sarah saw tears gathering there. The transformation in his demeanor was complete. Gone was the casual restaurant patron, replaced by someone bearing the full weight of military protocol and shared history. "The big red one," he said quietly, using the 1st Infantry Division's nickname. "Hill 875, November 1967. Sarah's heart stopped. Those were details that had never appeared in any of the official records she had found, details that her grandfather had never spoken about to anyone in the family. The coordinates on her tattoo marked that exact location, but she had only learned the basic facts about what had happened there. This man somehow knew specifics that had remained buried in her grandfather's memory until his death. The rude woman who had demanded a different server now looked completely bewildered. Her son was staring at the elderly man with growing recognition, as if he was beginning to realize who they were dealing with. Other diners had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary but not fully understanding what it was. "How do you know about that?" Sarah whispered, her professional composure finally cracking as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. The man reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It was clearly decades old, the colors faded and the edges worn from years of handling. He handed it to Sarah with hands that were now visibly shaking. "Because I was there," he said simply. Sarah looked down at the photograph and felt the world tilt around her. It showed a group of young soldiers in jungle fatigues, their faces dirty and exhausted but their eyes filled with the camaraderie of men who had faced death together. In the center of the group, she immediately recognized a much younger version of her grandfather, his arm around the shoulders of another soldier who looked remarkably like the elderly man now standing before her. "Miguel saved my life that day," the man continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I was one of the 3 soldiers he carried to safety. I've carried this picture with me for 56 years, and I've never forgotten what he did or what it cost him." The restaurant had become completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch the unfolding scene, sensing that something profound was happening. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the young face with the elderly man before her, trying to process the impossible coincidence that had brought them together in this moment. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her was beginning to piece together the implications. "Who are you?" The man straightened to his full height, and, suddenly, his bearing made perfect sense. When he spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had spent decades in positions of tremendous responsibility. "General Robert Harrison, United States Army, retired. And I owe your grandfather a debt that I've never been able to repay." The words hit the restaurant like a thunderclap. Sarah nearly dropped the photograph as the full weight of what she was hearing sank in. This wasn't just any elderly man who had happened to recognize her tattoo. This was a five-star general, one of the most senior military officers in the country, and he was telling her that her grandfather had saved his life. The woman who had complained about Sarah's tattoo looked as if she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her son was staring at the general with obvious awe, clearly recognizing the name and understanding exactly who they were in the presence of. The other diners seemed frozen in place, aware that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance but still struggling to understand how it had come about. General Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared memories that had clearly been with him for decades. "The ambush happened just before dawn. We were on patrol, moving through dense jungle, when the enemy opened fire from three sides. Miguel was our squad leader, and, when I took shrapnel in my leg and couldn't move, he came back for me. The enemy fire was so intense that our air support couldn't get close enough to help, and our radio operator had been killed in the first minutes of the attack." Sarah listened in stunned silence as the general described events that her grandfather had never talked about, filling in details of a story she had only known in fragments. She thought of all the times she had asked Miguel about the war, all the gentle deflections and changes of subject. Now she was learning that his reluctance to speak about his service hadn't been shame or trauma alone, but perhaps humility about actions he had considered simply doing his duty. "He could have waited for reinforcements," the general continued. "Any reasonable person would have. But Miguel saw that I was bleeding badly, and he knew that the other wounded soldiers wouldn't survive if we waited for help. So he made 3 separate trips into that killing field, carrying each of us to safety while enemy fire was tearing apart everything around him. On the last trip, when he came back for me, I told him to leave me and save himself." "You know what he said?" Sarah shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She had grown up thinking she knew her grandfather, but this story revealed depths of heroism that she had never imagined. "He said, 'Nobody gets left behind. That's not how this works.' And then, he picked me up like I weighed nothing and carried me 300 yards through enemy fire to the extraction point." The general's voice broke slightly as he finished. "I was unconscious by the time we reached safety, but I lived because of him. We all did." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she looked at it again, seeing new meaning in the faces of the young soldiers. These weren't just random men posing for a picture, they were warriors who had faced death together and survived because of her grandfather's courage. "I've spent my entire career trying to live up to the example he set that day," General Harrison said. "I've commanded troops in 4 different conflicts, served at the Pentagon, advised presidents on military strategy, and I've never encountered another soldier who embodied the values of honor, courage, and sacrifice the way Miguel Martinez did." The words on Sarah's tattoo suddenly took on new significance. Honor, courage, sacrifice, she had chosen them because they represented what she knew about her grandfather's character, but now she understood that they also represented specific actions he had taken, specific moments when he had embodied those values in ways that saved lives and changed the course of other people's destinies. "After the war," the general continued, "I tried to find him. I wanted to thank him properly, maybe recommend him for higher honors. But he had disappeared back into civilian life, and the military wasn't good at keeping track of veterans in those days. I've regretted losing touch with him for 56 years. Sarah wiped her eyes and tried to find her voice. "He came home to a country that called him a baby killer," she said quietly. "He never talked about the war because people made him feel ashamed of his service. He worked construction for 40 years, raised 5 children, and never asked for recognition or thanks.
He died believing that he was forgotten.
The general's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw anger flash in his eyes, not at her, but at the system and society that had failed to honor her grandfather's sacrifice.
That's exactly what was wrong with how we treated our Vietnam veterans, he said.
Good men like your grandfather came home to a country that blamed them for a war they didn't start, and we allowed heroes to disappear into anonymity while politicians who had never served made speeches about patriotism.
The emotional weight of the conversation was affecting everyone in the restaurant now.
Several diners were openly weeping, and even the staff members who had gathered to watch were visibly moved by what they were hearing. The woman who had complained about Sarah's tattoo looked mortified, clearly understanding now that her judgment had been not just wrong but profoundly ignorant. General Harrison reached out and gently took back the photograph, but not before pointing to another face in the group.
This is Captain James Morrison, and this is Lieutenant David Chen. Miguel saved all three of us that day. Morrison went on to become a federal judge. Chen became a neurosurgeon and saved thousands of lives during his career.
I became a general and served my country for 43 years. 3 men built entire careers of service to others because your grandfather refused to leave us behind. The scope of her grandfather's impact was beginning to dawn on Sarah. She had always known he was a good man, but she was learning that his actions on a single day in 1967 had rippled forward through decades, affecting not just the 3 men he saved but everyone whose lives had been touched by their subsequent service. Morrison's legal decisions, Chen's medical innovations, the general's military leadership, all of it stemmed from Miguel Martinez's choice to risk his own life for his comrades.
I want you to know, the general said, his voice returning to the formal tone of official business, that your grandfather's actions that day were submitted for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was lost in the bureaucratic chaos of the war, and, by the time anyone tried to follow up, the paperwork had disappeared and the witnesses had been scattered to different units. It was one of many injustices of that conflict. Sarah felt a mix of pride and sadness wash over her. Pride that her grandfather's heroism had been officially recognized, even if only briefly, and sadness that he had never known about the recommendation or received the recognition he deserved. She thought about how different his life might have been if he had come home to a Medal of Honor ceremony instead of protests and hostility. The general was studying her tattoo again, taking in details that she realized he was seeing with completely different eyes than anyone else who had looked at it. The forget-me-nots around the dog tags, he said. What's the significance of those flowers?
Sarah felt a small smile break through her tears. They were his favorite flowers. He grew them in his garden every year and said they represented true love and faithful memories. He told me that soldiers who died far from home deserved to be remembered with flowers that would never fade from the hearts of those who loved them.
The general nodded approvingly. Your grandfather was a philosopher as well as a warrior. Those flowers have deep meaning in military tradition. They represent remembrance of the fallen and faithfulness to their memory. The fact that you chose to include them shows that you understood his heart, not just his service record. The complexity and thoughtfulness of Sarah's tattoo was becoming clear to everyone who was listening.
What had initially appeared to be a teenager's rebellious act was revealing itself to be a carefully designed memorial, a work of art that captured the essence of a hero's character and preserved his memory in a way that would endure long after official records were filed away and forgotten. General Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The action seemed oddly formal, as if he was preparing for something of great importance. The entire restaurant remained hushed, everyone sensing that this extraordinary encounter was far from over. I need to make a phone call, the general said to Sarah, his tone taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to moving mountains with a few words. But, first, I want you to understand something. What happened here tonight wasn't chance. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to matters of honor and sacrifice. Your grandfather's spirit guided you to get that tattoo, and it guided me to be in this restaurant tonight. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as the general spoke. She had always felt a spiritual connection to her grandfather, especially since his death, but hearing this decorated military officer speak about Miguel's continuing influence felt like validation of something she had sensed but never been able to articulate. The general dialed a number and stepped slightly away from the table, but his voice was clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. When someone answered, his first words made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "This is General Harrison. I need you to pull all available records for Sergeant Miguel Martinez, 1st Infantry Division, service dates 1966 to 1968. Pay special attention to any recommendations for Valor Awards that may have been lost or misfiled. I want everything you can find on my desk first thing tomorrow morning." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded, and then, the general continued, his voice taking on the unmistakable tone of someone issuing orders that would be followed without question. "Furthermore, I want you to contact the Army Human Resources Command and have them begin the process for a posthumous award review. I have new witness testimony and photographic evidence related to actions that should have resulted in our nation's highest honor. This is a Priority 1 directive." Sarah felt tears welling up again as she realized what the general was doing. He wasn't just sharing memories or offering comfort, he was taking concrete action to correct a historical injustice. Her grandfather might be gone, but his service could still be properly recognized. The general ended the call and turned back to Sarah, his expression softer now but still carrying the weight of official purpose. "Your grandfather deserved better than he got from his country," he said. "I can't change the past, but I can make sure that his sacrifice is properly documented and honored. It may take time, but I give you my word that Miguel Martinez will receive the recognition he earned 56 years ago." The woman who had initially complained about Sarah's tattoo could no longer contain herself. She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. I owe you a tremendous apology," she stammered, addressing Sarah directly. "I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong. I'm sorry." Sarah looked at the woman, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. The anger and humiliation she had felt earlier had transformed into something else, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. This woman had just witnessed a profound lesson about the dangers of judging others based on surface appearances, and Sarah could see that the lesson had hit home. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "I hope you understand now that tattoos can mean different things to different people. Mine isn't about rebellion or poor judgment, it's about love, memory, and honoring someone who gave everything for others." The woman nodded, tears in her own eyes now. Her son reached over and squeezed her hand, and Sarah could see that this moment had become a learning experience for their entire family. General Harrison wasn't finished. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Sarah, but not before writing something on the back of it. "I want you to call me tomorrow," he said. "I have some things I'd like to share with you about your grandfather, stories that go beyond that one day in Vietnam. But, more importantly, I want to talk to you about your future." Sarah looked down at the business card and saw that he had written a phone number along with the words Scholarship Committee, United States Military Academy. Her breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. "You're graduating this summer, aren't you?" the general asked. "Planning to go to college?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, falling naturally into the respectful tone she had learned from her grandfather. "I've been accepted to several schools for international relations. I want to work in foreign service someday." The general smiled, and Sarah saw approval in his expression. "Your grandfather would be proud of that choice. Diplomacy and military service often go hand in hand, both require the same values of honor, courage, and sacrifice that he embodied. But I think there might be other paths worth considering as well." He gestured to her tattoo, which had started this entire encounter. "You chose to wear your values on your skin where everyone could see them, despite knowing that you'd face judgment and criticism. That takes a special kind of courage. You understand the importance of service and sacrifice, and you're not afraid to stand up for what you believe in even when it's difficult. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in future military leaders." Sarah felt her world shifting as she understood what the general was offering. She had always planned on serving her country, but she had envisioned doing so through diplomatic channels. The idea of following more directly in her grandfather's footsteps had never seriously occurred to her, partly because she had assumed that the military wouldn't want someone with visible tattoos. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "I thought the military had strict policies about tattoos. Everyone's told me that my tattoo would disqualify me from service." General Harrison laughed, the first genuinely joyful sound that had come from him all evening. Policies change, he said. And, more importantly, there are always exceptions for exceptional people. A tattoo that honors military service and embodies military values isn't a disqualification, it's a qualification. Any commanding officer who can't see that isn't fit to lead. The conversation was attracting attention from throughout the restaurant. Sarah noticed that several other diners had quietly moved closer to their table, and she realized that many of them were veterans themselves. An older man at a nearby table raised his coffee cup in a silent toast, and Sarah saw him mouth the words "thank you" before drinking. A woman wearing a Gold Star Mother's pin on her lapel nodded approvingly, understanding the significance of what was unfolding. "I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with your grandfather," General Harrison said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "It was in the medical tent after he carried me to safety. I was drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss, but I remember him sitting beside my stretcher. I thanked him for saving my life, and he said something I've never forgotten." Sarah leaned forward, hungry for any previously unknown details about her grandfather's character and thoughts. "He said, 'We're all connected, Lieutenant. Every life we save creates ripples that spread out through time in ways we can't imagine. I didn't just save you today, I saved everyone whose life you'll touch in the years to come.' That's what service really means, understanding that our actions echo through generations." The profound wisdom of Miguel's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had grown up thinking of her grandfather as a simple man who worked with his hands and loved his family. But these glimpses into his military service were revealing someone with deep philosophical understanding of duty, service, and the interconnected nature of human experience. "He was right," the general continued. "My career, Morrison's legal decisions, Chen's medical innovations, all of the good we've been able to do in our lives stems from the choice your grandfather made to risk everything for 3 men he barely knew. And, now, through you, those ripples are continuing to spread." Sarah thought about her own plans for the future, her desire to serve in the diplomatic corps, her dream of working to prevent conflicts before they required military intervention. She had always seen this as separate from her grandfather's military service, but now she understood that they were part of the same continuum of service and sacrifice. "The scholarship I mentioned isn't just about military training," General Harrison explained. "The Academy produces leaders who go on to serve in many different capacities, military officers, yes, but also diplomats, business leaders, politicians, and public servants of all kinds. The education is world-class, and the network of fellow graduates includes some of the most influential people in government and international affairs." The offer was tempting, but Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her life's trajectory. A few hours ago, she had been a small-town waitress counting down the days until she could escape to college and leave behind the judgment and small-mindedness of her community. Now she was being offered opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. "I need time to think about this," she said honestly. "It's a lot to process." "Of course," the general replied. "But don't take too long. The application deadline for next year's class is approaching, and I'll need time to prepare the necessary recommendations and paperwork. A personal endorsement from a 5-star general carries significant weight, but there are still procedures to follow." As if summoned by the mention of procedures, General Harrison's phone rang again. He answered it with his characteristic brisk efficiency, and Sarah could tell from his side of the conversation that his earlier call had already set significant wheels in motion. "Yes, I understand the complexity," he was saying. "But I'm telling you that Sergeant Martinez's actions on Hill 875 warrant the highest recognition our nation can bestow. I don't care how many regulations we have to navigate or how many forms need to be filed. This is a matter of justice, not bureaucracy." Sarah watched in amazement as this powerful man used his influence and authority to advocate for her grandfather's memory. She thought about all the people over the years who had dismissed Miguel as just another construction worker, never knowing that they were in the presence of a genuine American hero. The general ended his call and turned back to Sarah with a satisfied expression. "The wheels are turning," he said. "It may take months or even years to work through all the bureaucratic channels, but your grandfather's case is now officially under review for a posthumous Medal of Honor." The magnitude of what was happening finally hit Sarah fully. Her grandfather, who had died thinking his service was forgotten, might posthumously receive the nation's highest military honor. The tattoo that had brought her so much criticism and judgment had led directly to this moment of recognition and validation. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the East Room of the White House, wearing her dress blue uniform as a cadet at the United States Military Academy. The room was filled with dignitaries, military officials, and members of her extended family who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. Her tattoo, now a source of pride rather than shame, was visible beneath the short sleeves of her dress uniform, and she noticed several high-ranking officers studying it with interest and respect. The decision to accept General Harrison's offer had not been easy. Sarah had spent weeks weighing her options, consulting with family members, and soul-searching about whether military service was truly her calling. The turning point had come during a visit to her grandfather's grave, where she had sat for hours talking to his headstone about her fears and uncertainties. As she spoke to Miguel's memory that day, she had felt a sense of peace and clarity that she had never experienced before. The tattoo on her shoulder had seemed to warm against her skin, and she had understood with perfect certainty that her grandfather's spirit was guiding her toward a path of service that would honor his memory while fulfilling her own potential. The application process for West Point had been grueling, involving multiple interviews, physical fitness tests, academic evaluations, and background checks. But General Harrison's endorsement had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and Sarah's own qualifications had carried her through the selection process with distinction. Her first semester at the academy had been challenging in ways she had never imagined. The academic rigor was intense, the physical demands were exhausting, and the military discipline required constant adjustment. But she had thrived in an environment where her values were not only accepted but celebrated, where her tattoo was seen as evidence of her commitment to service rather than a mark of rebellion. Now, as she stood in the White House, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The research into her grandfather's military record had uncovered a wealth of information that had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of the Vietnam era. Witness statements from the 3 men he had saved, unit records that had been misfiled for decades, and photographic evidence had all combined to build an overwhelming case for posthumous recognition. President Williams stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. Sarah's heart raced as she thought about her grandfather and how proud he would have been to see his granddaughter standing in this hallowed space, representing not just her own achievements but the continuing legacy of his service and sacrifice. Today we gather to right a historical wrong, the president began, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to the occasion. 57 years ago, a young sergeant from Texas demonstrated the highest values of military service in the jungles of Vietnam. His actions saved 3 lives and exemplified the motto that no soldier is ever left behind. Through bureaucratic failures and the chaos of war, his heroism went unrecognized for more than half a century. Today, we correct that injustice. Sarah felt tears beginning to form as the president continued, describing her grandfather's actions on Hill 875 with details that she was still learning even now. The investigation into his service had revealed not just the dramatic rescue that General Harrison had witnessed, but a pattern of leadership and courage that had earned Miguel the quiet respect of everyone who had served with him. The Medal of Honor is not awarded lightly, President Williams continued. It represents the highest form of valor in action against an enemy force, and it is reserved for those whose courage goes beyond the call of duty. Sergeant Miguel Martinez embodied these qualities when he repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to save his wounded comrades, and it is long past time that our nation formally acknowledged his sacrifice. General Harrison, now wearing his full dress uniform with 5 stars gleaming on his shoulders, stepped forward to accept the medal on behalf of Miguel's family. Sarah had been designated as the primary family representative, and she would receive the medal from the general in a moment that would symbolically complete the circle that had begun in that restaurant 6 months earlier. As she watched the ceremony unfold, Sarah thought about how dramatically her life had changed since that summer evening when she was just a small-town waitress dealing with ignorant comments about her tattoo. The judgment and criticism that had once made her feel isolated and defensive now seemed like necessary preparation for the challenges she would face as a military officer. She had learned to stand firm in her convictions, to maintain her dignity in the face of adversity, and to find strength in the values that her grandfather had passed down to her. The West Point experience had also connected her with other cadets who understood the weight of family military tradition. She had made friends whose grandfathers had served in World War II, whose parents had deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, whose siblings were currently serving in active duty units around the world. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who didn't see her tattoo as a mark of rebellion but as a badge of honor that connected her to something larger than herself. "Cadet Martinez," the president said, and Sarah snapped to attention as her name was called. "Please step forward to receive this medal on behalf of your family and in honor of your grandfather's service." Sarah marched forward with the precise military bearing she had spent months perfecting at West Point. As she approached the president, she caught sight of General Harrison's face and saw tears in the eyes of the tough old soldier. This moment represented not just recognition for Miguel's heroism, but vindication for all the Vietnam veterans who had come home to indifference or hostility instead of the gratitude they deserved. President Williams placed the Medal of Honor around Sarah's neck, the weight of the medal feeling substantial against her chest. As he did so, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of the young woman you've become," he said. "This medal represents his service, but your presence here today represents the continuing power of his example." Sarah struggled to maintain her military composure as the emotional weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Miguel's final words to her about honor being something you carry in your heart, and she understood now that this ceremony wasn't just about looking backward to honor the past, but about looking forward to the responsibilities that came with carrying on his legacy. After the formal ceremony concluded, there was a reception in the state dining room where Sarah had the opportunity to meet with other Medal of Honor recipients and their families. These conversations provided her with insights into the unique bond shared by those who had received or inherited the nation's highest military honor, and she began to understand the responsibilities that came with being part of this exclusive brotherhood. General Harrison found her during the reception, approaching with two elderly gentlemen whom Sarah immediately recognized from the faded photograph he had shown her months earlier. Captain Morrison, now a federal judge, and Dr. Chen, the neurosurgeon, had both traveled to Washington to attend the ceremony honoring the man who had saved their lives. "Sarah," General Harrison said, "I'd like you to meet the other two men who owe their lives to your grandfather." Judge Morrison stepped forward first, grasping Sarah's hands in both of his. "I've wanted to meet you since Bob told me about finding you," he said, using the general's first name with the familiarity of old comrades. Miguel talked about his family constantly during those long days in the hospital after the ambush. He was so proud of his children and so hopeful about the grandchildren he would someday have. I think he would be amazed to see how perfectly his dreams came true. Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "Your grandfather had a gift for seeing potential in people," he said. "He encouraged me to pursue medicine when I was just a scared young soldier who thought he might not survive the war. He told me that the world needed doctors more than it needed warriors, and that my job was to save lives rather than take them. I've performed over 10,000 surgeries in my career, and I think of him every time I step into an operating room." Sarah felt the full scope of her grandfather's impact beginning to crystallize. The three men he had saved had gone on to touch thousands of other lives through their careers in military service, law, and medicine. The ripple effects that Miguel had spoken about in that medical tent had indeed spread across decades and generations, creating a legacy of service that extended far beyond what any single act of heroism might normally achieve. "We've established something in his honor," General Harrison said, producing an official-looking document. "The Miguel Martinez Foundation for Military Families. It provides scholarships for the children and grandchildren of veterans who want to pursue careers in public service. We thought it was appropriate that his legacy should continue to create opportunities for others to serve." Sarah read through the foundation documents, marveling at the scope of what these three successful men had created in her grandfather's memory. The foundation would provide not just financial support but mentorship and networking opportunities for young people who shared Miguel's values but might not otherwise have access to elite educational institutions or government positions. "We'd like you to serve on the board when you graduate from West Point," Judge Morrison said. "Your perspective as a young person and as Miguel's granddaughter would be invaluable in guiding the foundation's work." The offer represented yet another way that her grandfather's legacy would continue to shape her life and career. Sarah thought about the teenagers who might benefit from the foundation's support, young people who faced the same kinds of judgment and limited opportunities that she had experienced in her small Texas town. The idea of helping others overcome those obstacles felt like a perfect way to honor Miguel's memory. As the reception continued, Sarah found herself in conversations with congressional leaders, military officials, and members of the diplomatic corps. Many of them had heard about the unusual circumstances that had led to the discovery of her grandfather's heroism, and they were curious about her own plans for service. She spoke passionately about her interest in international relations and her hope of working to prevent conflicts before they required military intervention. Diplomacy and military service are two sides of the same coin, observed Senator Rodriguez, who chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. Both require understanding of sacrifice, courage in the face of adversity, and commitment to values larger than oneself. Your grandfather's example and your military training would serve you well in the diplomatic corps. The conversation reinforced Sarah's growing understanding that her path didn't have to follow a single trajectory. The leadership skills she was developing at West Point, combined with her passion for international affairs, could lead to opportunities she had never imagined. She might serve as a military attaché at an embassy, work in the State Department's security division, or pursue advanced degrees that would prepare her for senior diplomatic positions. Late in the evening, after most of the other guests had departed, Sarah found herself alone with General Harrison in one of the White House's quieter corridors. The formal ceremony was over, the medals had been awarded, and the speeches had been made, but she sensed that the most important conversation of the day was just beginning. Your grandfather would have handled today exactly the way you did, the general said quietly. With dignity, grace, and appropriate humility. He always understood that honor wasn't about seeking recognition but about doing what was right regardless of whether anyone was watching. Sarah touched the Medal of Honor that still hung around her neck, feeling its weight as both a tribute to the past and a responsibility for the future. I keep thinking about what he said about ripples spreading through time, she replied. I understand now that this isn't really about him anymore, it's about what we do with the opportunities that his sacrifice created. General Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. That's exactly the kind of wisdom that convinced me you were ready for West Point, he said. You understand that leadership isn't about personal glory but about serving something larger than yourself. That understanding will serve you well, whether your career takes you into the military, diplomacy, or any other field where strong leadership is needed. As they walked toward the White House entrance, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A tattoo that had once made her feel isolated and judged had become the catalyst for opportunities she had never dared to imagine. Her grandfather's forgotten heroism had been restored to its rightful place in military history. And she had found her own path forward, one that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. The young woman who walked out of the White House that night was fundamentally different from the small-town waitress who had endured criticism about her tattoo just 6 months earlier. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who understood her place in a larger story, someone who had learned to see judgment and adversity as opportunities to demonstrate character rather than obstacles to overcome. Sarah Martinez was no longer just Miguel Martinez's granddaughter, she was a leader in her own right, someone whose future contributions to her country would create new ripples that would spread through time in ways that no one could yet imagine. And, on her shoulder, the tattoo that had started it all remained as both a memorial to the past and a promise for the future, a permanent reminder that honor, courage, and sacrifice were not just words on her skin but principles that would guide her actions for the rest of her life.